Well, hello and welcome back to our study of the Gospel of Mark. We are looking at the remarkable journey continues, Gospel of urgency, and we're looking specifically at Mark chapters 4 through 7. I just want to remind you that a few years ago we looked at Mark chapters 1 through 3. You'll see in the end screen on YouTube that this will pop up so you can see any of the videos there in the playlist, as well as be able to go back and look at some of these on your own. We're almost to the conclusion. This is lesson 12. We're looking at a title, Don't Be Afraid. We're going to be looking specifically at chapter 6, verses 45 to 53, but we'll have a little bit of a bonus this lesson so that we can kind of bring to conclusion this part of the ministry of Jesus. And you'll know what I mean when we get there. Then we'll have one more lesson left. And in lesson 13, we'll look at Mark chapter 7, at least the majority of it. We'll bring our unit to conclusion. It's been a good study, and hopefully you'll go back and read Mark, look at it closely, and as I've said before, look at it with a view to seeing not only what Mark has to say about Jesus and his ministry, but how he goes about saying it. So you can live it out as he portrays that lesson for us. Well, we've just watched, or we just studied the feeding of the 5,000, and there's movement now further into the ministry of Jesus. I won't go into any more detail here. I want to prepare us for what we're going to read. I'll go through an outline real quickly with you, then I'll give you an introduction, and then we'll walk through that outline as we go through it verse by verse and phrase by phrase, as I've said before. Happy that you're with me. Pray that you'll continue to study the Word of God with me and continue to seek out who Jesus is as we read each part of the Gospel of Mark. There's some wonderful things in this lesson, some challenging application for us, and then also more insight into who Jesus is as we go through this text. Go with me then as we look at the outline. I want to call your attention to the basic part of what we're going to be looking at. It's a short passage in and of itself. As I said, there's going to be a little bit of bonus. I'll mention that to you in a moment. But as we do that, we want to be as much detail as necessary to be able to work through and be able to capture all that God wants us to have through this text. The title of our lesson, as you see there, is Don't Be Afraid. We're going to be looking at verses 45 to 46, and we'll call this Everyone Dismissed and Jesus Alone. Not being real neat and very original with these titles. I'm just giving you basically a summary of what takes place in that text. Verses 47 and 48, we'll see Jesus sees the disciples struggling. Then we'll see Jesus walking on the water, verses 49 to 50. Clearly, we're talking about Jesus walking on the water. And then we'll bring the basic part of the lesson to conclusion with verses 51 to 53, where Jesus gets in the boat and they land at Gennesaret. The reason I point that out is, as we'll read in a moment, they were intended to go somewhere else, and they ended up at Gennesaret. And then here's bonus. I think it's important that we bring this text to its conclusion. It's not part of our original study, but I think we don't want to leave a gap between verses 53 and then chapter 7, verse 1. So we're going to look at what happens when Jesus gets to Gennesaret. Well, let's go ahead and look at our lesson then and walk through it. I'll be going through this through the premium commentary that I wrote for this unit for Baptist General Convention of Texas, the GC2 Press. I have a hard time sometimes distilling what I've written so that it can just be the basic part of it. I want to give you as much as I've put into it so that you can gather as much as there is. And there's always more. I'm not the only one that has anything to say about this, and there's always something else that can be said. But what I want to point out is, as I go through this, it might be you recognize the last several lessons have been quite long, and it's because I've tried to give you as much as I could in the text. So I hope that you'll enjoy and then learn through what we've discussed as we go through the text. Let's get into it and talk about what Jesus does, how this impacts the disciples, and get some insight into who the disciples are as they wrestle with the identity of Jesus. And then as we apply this text in many ways to our own lives, think about our own relationship with Jesus and the ways that we have to overcome certain fears when we encounter Jesus as well. Now, let me go through the text with you. We've already looked at the outline. Let me read the text to you. I do want to read that bonus part as well, and then we'll come back and go through the text. Let's go ahead and read from the New American Standard Bible, the 2020 edition. It says this, and immediately Jesus and had his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he himself dismissed the crowd. And after saying goodbye to them, he left for the mountain to pray. When it was evening, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them, and about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea, and he intended to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought that it was a ghost, and they cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke with them and said to them, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished, for they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Well, then we see the next part of the passage. When they had crossed over, they came to the land at Gennesaret and moored at the shore. And when they got out of the boat, immediately the people recognized him and ran about that entire country and began carrying here and there on their pallets those who were sick, to wherever they heard he was. And whenever he entered villages or cities or countryside, they were laying the sick in the marketplaces and imploring him that they might just touch the fringe of his cloak, and all who touched it were being healed. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at what's going on here with this text. First with the disciples on the sea, then with what takes place at Gennesaret. A lot of times fear comes from a lack of understanding. To this point in Mark's gospel, the disciples have been traveling with Jesus as he taught and he healed people. They even had gone on mission for him. They have witnessed numerous events and encounters, and still they appear to have had a difficult time grasping the identity of Jesus and what all that meant. Yes, they knew Jesus. They spent all the time that they had with him. They were always with him. With each of these events and encounters, Jesus was revealing something about himself. We pointed that out from lesson to lesson. We want to recognize that as we read these texts. The first question is, what is this saying about Jesus? Well, in Mark 4, the disciples witnessed Jesus still a storm by speaking to it. They saw him cast out demons. He healed the sick. The most recent miracle, of course, that they had witnessed and had actually taken part in was the feeding of the 5,000. But were they really understanding what was happening before their eyes? Were they comprehending who it was that they were following? Well, back in Mark chapter, or in this text of Mark chapter 6, verses 45 to 53, Mark recounts another event in their walk with Jesus that served to reveal what little they understood about Jesus and how the lack of understanding resulted in their response to another challenging situation. Their previous experiences, and the most recent one with the feeding of the 5,000, should have prepared them in some way for this next experience. But since they didn't fully grasp what was happening before their eyes each time, they were missing something. And that lack of understanding came out in the form of fear during this latest encounter with Jesus. Well, I want to go back and read a couple of the verses again. The first part of our outline, of course, is Mark chapter 6, verses 45 to 46, where everyone is dismissed and Jesus is alone. So let's go ahead and look at that again real quickly to set the tone for how we understand this text. It says, immediately Jesus had his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he himself dismissed the crowd. And after saying goodbye to them, he left for the mountain to pray. Well, as we read, we can recognize that there was no staying around after feeding the 5,000. Mark employed his favorite adverb, the verb adverb immediately. Euthus is the Greek word. It even sounds fast. He uses that word immediately to describe the next activity. Jesus sends his disciples away as he stays behind. The manner in which Jesus had the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him was not by suggestion. In other words, he's not saying, why don't you go ahead and do this? He's doing it in a way of a command. The word used translated had the disciples get into the boat. The word had there is the idea of compelling and constraining. And I think the NIV, the New International Version, does well with this. It says that Jesus made them get in the boat. Maybe they wanted to stay with Jesus, and he's saying, you need to go. Jesus had to go back and pray. He directed them on to something else. Mark didn't give the reason for the compulsion, The word then for the phrase go ahead of is the same as was what Mark used to describe how the crowds went ahead of Jesus before he and the disciples arrived on shore where he would teach and feed them. Go back to look at the feeding of the 5,000. Prior to that, in Mark chapter 6, verse 33, they're arriving, and it said that the people, when they see Jesus and the disciples, they go ahead of Jesus and the disciples to where they eventually land, and he goes on to teach and eventually feeds the 5,000 there. So, and then the phrase to the other side highlights again their move back and forth around the Galilee. So it says he's sending them to the other side. And again, if we had a map, you can just look at one and see all the different places that are mentioned from whatever perspective they are. When Mark gives that narrative, they're going to the other side. They're just back and forth, back and forth. They're traveling. This is why they call it the Great Galilean Ministry. Go back and look at passages like Mark chapter 4, verse 35, and then Mark 5, 1 and verse 21, and then Mark 8, verse 13. They're constantly going back and forth. So we see again the way Mark tells us the narrative. He gives us details from time to time, then he'll stop down and just kind of summarize some things. And we're seeing details here. We'll see some summary in a moment. Mark specified that the other side meant going to Bethsaida. And we'll talk about that when we get near the end of this passage as well. Jesus sent them on until he dismissed the crowd. So earlier we saw that when they got ready to go, Jesus had the disciples dismiss the crowds. But here he dismisses the crowds himself. So go back and look at Mark 4:36, where Jesus, at that point, when they got ready to leave, he had the disciples dismiss the crowd. Here he's doing it. So he's moving them around. Then we look at verse 46. Jesus did not stay in that place. When he sends the disciples away, he doesn't stay either. He says goodbye to them, as we'll read in a moment, and then he goes on somewhere else. After leaving them, Jesus went to the mountain to pray. Now, the New American Standard Bible 2020 edition that we're reading for this lesson says that Jesus said goodbye to them. We read that and picture in our minds his speaking some kind of farewell. He might have done that, but the phrase is a word of action. And the NIV, I think, helps a little bit. It says simply after leaving them. So he's bidding them farewell, but it's really an action word. The pronoun them likely refers to the crowd. So he sends the disciples on their way. He says goodbye or leaves the crowds that are just then mentioned because he's the one dismissing the crowds. The disciples had already gone on. Jesus sent the disciples ahead, but he did not follow them, as we've mentioned. Instead, he went on to a mountain to pray. The original text, the Greek word here, has the word the mountain in it. And it could refer to the one mountain that he was at recently or to a specific mountain that would be known by the disciples, such that the specific designation, the mountain, could be used. In other words, there might be a specific mountain that was common to Jesus where he would go away to pray. It could be that, or it could be the mountain that they had just been recently. More importantly, though, was the reason that he went. So it is reasonable to assume that Jesus compelled the disciples to the boat and to go on so that he could stay back and spend time in prayer. Very clearly, that's what the text says. He went on a mountain to the mountain to pray. Jesus gave priority to prayer. And we want to bring up a couple of passages from another text for you to ponder here. This is not uncommon for Jesus. Luke 6, chapter 12, for instance, indicates that Jesus spent the whole night in prayer on a mountain before he selected the 12. Then you read again in Luke chapter 9, verse 28, Jesus went up on a mountain to pray when he was transfigured. And then we read even earlier in Mark, very common passage, Mark 1:35, where it says that he went alone to pray. Prayer is very important in the life of Jesus, and we see that mentioned here in the Gospel of Mark. We see it a number of times in the Gospel of Luke as well. So the scene is set. Jesus has set the disciples on their way. He has stayed back to pray. But now Mark moves the narrative back to the disciples and how the disciples and Jesus meet up again. So let me read to you verses 47 and 48. Mark says this: When it was evening, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them, at about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea, and he intended to pass by them. Well, Mark provided a quick update to set the scene for what was about to happen next. He indicated what time of day it was, evening, and then he highlighted the contrast of the location of the disciples and the location of Jesus. In referencing the disciples, he simply mentioned the boat. The boat was in the middle of the sea. Of course, it doesn't mean that it has to be that it was like geographically in the middle of the sea. They were in the water. It simply points out they were far enough away from shore that they could be considered in the middle. Well, then Mark reminds the reader, you and I, of Jesus' location. He was on the land. So you see this distinction here. Jesus has sent them on. He has stayed back. Now Mark picks up the narrative with only a change of verse to say the disciples were in the middle of the sea, but Jesus was on the land. And here's what happens next. The disciples were in the boat on the sea. Jesus was on the shore, yet Jesus could see them even in the darkness, even in the darkness. Again, Mark has a very vivid way of expressing the events that he depicts. A quick stop down. I mentioned it before, I'll continue to mention it. I hope that you'll come to read the Gospels, not only because of the theology and what they tell us about Jesus, but the way each of the authors does this. Each of them has a style, sometimes overlapping with one another because there is some kind of interdependence between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But often there's some injection of their own style here. There's a way that they've captured this and express it so that you can be part of it as you read it. Mark is giving us details. He's not just summarizing certain things about the life of Jesus. He's helping us visualize and almost participate in the text. He's very vivid then in the way he does this. Well, he reports what Jesus saw and how Jesus had reacted. He saw the struggles of the disciples in detail, or he showed the disciples and their struggle in detail. What Jesus saw was, and the words are captured in the New American Standard, the disciples were straining at the oars. We've talked about the wind and the sea before. Go back to the stilling of the storm. Here you can see that they're on the boat, in the boat, the winds are blowing, and they're trying to control things and where they're going. They're straining at the oars. In the original text, and we're looking at the original Greek here, obviously we have a translation. Mark said that they were distressed in their rowing. They were in a current state of distress as they rowed. You can imagine they're not just working; they're feverishly working, but they're in distress. They are really they are de-stressed and stressed. Okay, the way it's also depicted is that this was an ongoing battle in view of what they were facing. The reason they were distressed in their rowing, the reason that the rowing was a battle, the way Mark puts it, is that the wind was against them. Now, the text reads almost as if the wind had some kind of personal vendetta against them. The wind was in a state of being against them, as it says. Now, to be sure, the strong wind, so common an occurrence on the Sea of Galilee, was not against them personally, but the result was that the wind had possessed such strength that it was a major challenge to them. So that was their opposition. They were trying to press against the wind to get to go where they needed to. The wind was so strong. They were in distress in their rowing. And it says Jesus saw this. Keep in mind, Jesus sees all this, and then capture what Mark tells us about Jesus' intention, which almost doesn't make sense as we think about it. Well, Mark identified the specific time of the evening. We know it's dark, it's night. The disciples were on the water, battling the wind, as Mark says, the fourth watch of the night. Now, in other words, they were still out on the water into the early morning. The fourth watch of the night was between 3 and 6 a.m. Again, no details are given about the travels while Jesus sent them away. Again, they were sent away overnight. He goes to the mountain. Now it's the middle of the night, almost early morning. We don't know what's been going on in their travels. We'll come back to that in a second. We just know that they're on the water still. Mark doesn't tell us about where they've been. Jesus has sent them away. We don't know if they made it there or not. The question is, he sent them to Bethsaida. Had they gone to Bethsaida and were now going elsewhere? We'll see where they land in a moment. But why would they do that without instruction from Jesus? Why would he send them to Bethsaida? Then they start making their way back. Maybe they've just been tossed around all night and they've never gone. The next question we can think about, were they headed back to get Jesus? There was never any indication that they were supposed to do that either. That they ended up in Gennesaret, as we'll read in verse 53 in a moment, it might speak against that, though there could be a different reason they ended up there. Well, we can speculate all we want about such matters. What Mark does is tell us what Jesus did when he saw the disciples in distress. Let me kind of capture that again. He sends them to Bethsaida. We don't know if they get there or not. When they eventually get on shore after this event at Gennesaret, there could be a number of things going on here. Maybe Mark will cut things up and just kind of edit so that they eventually did get to Bethsaida and that this traveling to Gennesaret was a little bit after. We're not sure. Mark doesn't tell us all the details. It could be that they were on their way to Bethsaida, got thrown off course. Jesus meets them, and then they end up at Gennesaret. We'll see what happens there. The point is that they're all over the place and they're in distress, and Jesus sees them. Then Jesus goes and walks on the water, and he's walking toward them, but as we'll see in a moment, with the intention of going past them. The scholars have wrestled with this language here, and I don't think there's a reason to, but I understand why they do. We'll give a response to this. There are some who say that this was an illusion, not that Jesus was walking on the water, but that he was walking beside the water. Because it's evening and it's windy, it may have looked like Jesus was walking on the water. Um, he might have been just walking by the sea, and that illusion of walking on the water. Now, while that might be a possibility with regard to the way this word is used from time to time, it's better to understand that it means that he was walking on the water. Even though it can mean beside, it really does mean on, as we'll see. Other factors mitigate against it meaning beside the water. First, in the previous verse, Jesus was on the land, and then the preposition there very clearly meant it was on the land. It's the same preposition used here with the word sea. In other words, he was on the land, now he's on the sea. So the word is used in the same way. So when it says on the sea, it makes more sense grammatically that he was walking on the water, not beside the sea. Secondly, in verse 51, after the disciples saw him and were afraid, Jesus got into the boat with them. So we have to recognize they're in the middle of the sea. Jesus sees them and he's walking on the water. It makes no sense to say that he was walking beside the water and then all of a sudden he gets in the boat with them, especially because we'll see in a moment they're going to go somewhere else. Remember as well that Mark reported that the boat, as we said, was in the middle of the sea. No reference to them being on the land again until verse 53. Mark's comments about Jesus wanting to pass by them as he walked on the water raises some questions as well. I mean, think about it. He sees them struggling. He's on the water walking. He goes toward them, but his intent is to go past them. Why would Jesus go out to them after seeing them struggle, only to pass by them? Is this simply what the disciples perceived was the case? Maybe they thought he didn't see them. They would, in a moment, see him, and they call out to him. What? We don't know. The notion is not corrected by Mark. In other words, it wasn't that they perceived he was going to pass by. Mark says he intended that he was going to pass by. He's the one who said, Mark is, that Jesus intended to pass them by. Was Jesus planning all along to meet the disciples at their destination, and that is where he was going when he spotted them? In other words, he knows where they're going. He intends to get there. He's just going to take the route of walking on the water. Well, then he spots them. Who knows? If so, he could have stayed on shore to do that. He could have stayed on shore to keep walking to where they were going, just like when they went from one side to the other and the crowds followed them on shore. Jesus could have stayed on shore to follow them and meet them where they were going. Yet the text says he went out to them. Perhaps it meant that he was intending to pass by them so that they could see him. And what do we mean by that? That they would witness him and who he was in the state of miracle walking on the water. What would be significant about that? What can we know from the Bible that would be significant about walking on the water? It could be something like this. Jesus walking on the water is his playing out a scene from the Old Testament where God revealed himself by, quote, passing by. Jesus is passing by them on the boat. We can see from Exodus 33, verse 19 and 22, then also in Exodus 34, verse 6, and then later in 1 Kings 19:11, the Elijah passage, where God passes by. Here's Jesus passing them by. The passage most closely connected to what Jesus was doing because it involves God passing by on water and the inability of Job to see or perceive is Job 9, verse 8 and 9:11. As such, if this is the case, Jesus was revealing something about himself. What was he revealing about himself? He was revealing himself as God. He can do this because he was God. Real quick stop before we go on to verses 49 and 50. Remember back in the early part of Jesus' ministry when Jesus is teaching in a house and the house is full of people, friends bring a man who is crippled on a pallet and they can't get in because the crowd has kept them out. So they bust through the roof, lower him. Jesus says to the man, your sins are forgiven. And of course, the religious leaders are like, who can forgive sins except God alone? Well, Jesus then goes on to say, which is easier for me to say that his sins are forgiven or to tell him to take up his mat and walk and go home? That you may know that the Son of Man has authority to forgive sin, asking the disciple or to the religious leaders. He then turns to the man and says, take up your mat, walk, and go home. What was he doing? They said only God can forgive sins. And Jesus basically says, you're right. And he proves that he has authority to do this. His forgiving that man's sins was demonstration that he was God. Well, here, there's some subtle way, and what Jesus is doing is revealing something about himself. He is God over the chaos of the water, and even as God passed by people in the Old Testament and in Job, specifically thinking about the water, Jesus is saying something. What's going on? There's a revelation here of us being able to take two and two and putting them together to come up with four. Are the disciples aware of this? He's doing something to reveal something about himself, and they're not getting it. And that's going to be part of the point of the story moving forward in this passage. Side note for our question for now, we'll come up with it later as well. Are we paying attention to when God works in our life? We're in fear, yet God is working, and we don't catch it because we are not aware of and remembering of the things he's done before, not only in scripture, but in our own lives. To reveal to us that this is him again. He's making another appearance. Well, that's what's going on a little bit here. I'm not going to hold dogmatically to that, but we have to consider what might be going on. I'll just say this. Look at some of the cross references in your Bibles with regard to Jesus walking on the water. Clearly, there was the water incident when he stilled the storm, and now there's the walking on the water with the winds high and causing distress among the disciples. Something happens, though, of course, when he gets in the boat. So let's go ahead and read verses 49 to 50. The disciples see Jesus walking on the water, and then there's a conclusion. Verses 49 to 50. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost, and they cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke with them and said to them, take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid. Well, let's look at verses 49 to 50. It says this. When the disciples saw Jesus walking on the water, they did see what they did see. How do I put this? They did to see it was him. Okay. In other words, they looked out on the water. They see this figure. They want to see who it is. Now, they had no reason to believe that the phenomenon there was an experience of a person. No one's ever walked on water. They're not thinking about seeing a person walking on water. So their reaction to what they see is, now we're told they see Jesus, but that's Mark telling us, the reader, who they saw. They're not perceiving that at that moment. So one, they're not expecting a person to be walking on the water, let alone Jesus himself. People just don't walk on the water. Their own worldview then led them to this first thought that Mark tells us was their thought. They thought that they were seeing a ghost. Now, that Greek word there, and I know I bring up the language a lot, and I think it's important for us to recognize sometimes where our words come from, but also to give a little bit more clarity that a translation itself can't give, that our explanation can. But the word that's used here is a word that you're familiar with. It's the word phantasmos, phantasm or phantom. Something is an apparition, if you will. Uh, we have to be careful with what we mean by that word now that we're using it, as opposed to what they meant when they used it in that context. But there's some overlap here. We need to be careful not to infuse that into that earlier usage, our later meaning. However, it's very important to recognize they saw something that was not human. They were seeing something that was not, in their minds, was not a physical body. The word appears only here and in Matthew's parallel account of the same event. It has the meaning like an apparition. Something was appearing to them. So ghost may be the best choice. We have to be careful again because what we mean by ghost, and especially when the term ghost is used of Holy Ghost in the King James Bible, that's a totally different word altogether. Still, that comes with certain baggage when we hear the word ghost. Indeed, they saw him walking on the water, but they did not see him. Mark tells us they saw Jesus walking on the water, but they thought it was a ghost. So they didn't see him. They saw something else. In their minds, as their mind is interpreting what they're seeing, they're not thinking Jesus. What they thought they saw caused them to cry out. It's the emphatic form of the word for crying out as well. So it's the same word that was used to describe the reaction of the unclean spirit when it encountered Jesus in the synagogue. Go back to look at Mark chapter 1, verse 23. Very meaningful opening scene in the ministry of Jesus. That's that demon, that unclean spirit just cries out. He's in terror as to being cast out by Jesus. Luke uses the word to describe the shrieking cry of legion in his account of Jesus healing the demoniac in the Gadarenes. Mark and Matthew don't use that language. Luke does. So it's important to recognize how strong a word this is. The disciples then were utterly terrified, and they expressed that terror accordingly. They cried out in almost a shriek, "What in the world do we see?" This is terrifying to them. In sum, then, if this was the case that Jesus wanted them to see him, then verse 49 reveals it was mission accomplished because they did see him. However, if his intent was that they see him for who he was, then like in Job, in his own lament, back in that passage we referenced, they failed to see. They failed to perceive. Even after they did learn it was Jesus, they didn't at that moment grasp the greater significance of what they were witnessing. Back and listen to that again. In fact, let me just read that again to you. If it was the case that Jesus wanted them to see him, then verse 49 does reveal it was his mission and it was accomplished, or his mission was accomplished. They did see him. However, if it was intent that they see him for who he really was, then like in Job, in his own lament, they failed to see. They failed to perceive. Even after they did learn it was Jesus, they didn't at that moment grasp the greater significance of what they were witnessing. Even when they come to realize it was Jesus, they don't grasp all that it meant that he was walking on the water. They're not grasping everything. We're going to read here in a moment why that is. And that's a challenge for us. Verse 50, indeed, they saw him. And in fact, they all saw him. But as indicated above, indicated as what I just mentioned, their response was one of screaming out. They cried out because they were terrified. As we said, the word is very strong here. It means they were troubled. They were stirred up. They were in their terror. They were troubled and stirred up. As those words in English might not fully convey the level of the sense of disturbance, the word terrified at least captures the rationale for their screaming out. Why were they screaming out? They were terrified. The disciples had only seen him, but not knowing that it was him. And when they cried out in terror, there's that adverb immediately again. Immediately he spoke with them and said to them, and here's where Jesus now speaks, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." That idea of taking courage. Let me come back real quick. When he says, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid," he was seeking to calm them down and to give them reassurance that they were not in danger. They're already scared being on the water. It's rushing, it's moving, the wind is blowing them everywhere. They see this phantasm, not recognizing that it's Jesus. So he speaks to them to let them know that it's him and to assure them they're not in danger. He's letting them know you have no reason to fear. The word there then, take courage, is the same word used when Jesus is speaking in the Gospel of John, that farewell discourse, and he tells the disciples, "In the world you have tribulation, but take courage, I have overcome the world." Go look in John 16:33. Well, then Jesus identified himself with the words, "It is I." Yes, Jesus was doing that, but there's a reason to believe he was doing even more. So what I'm saying is, yes, he's identifying it's I, it's Jesus. He even doesn't say it's Jesus. He just says it's I. There's language that he's used before in that regard. But there's more going on here, similar to what we see in the Gospel of John, we'll mention in a moment. He's saying it is I. The word, the way the phrase is used in the original is just with the simple I am. In English, we have a hard time saying I am without following it up with something else. Here, we would then say it is I. But what's going on with that? I am. The original statement is I am. While the translation is it is I, to hear it as I am might conjure up some other thoughts in the minds of the reader, if we're familiar, and with the disciples specifically. What's going on? It's the same kind of construction that is used in John 8:58 when Jesus is having conflict with the religious leaders, and he says, "Before Abraham was, I am." They're talking about who Jesus is, and he's the son of the devil. Jesus says, "No, your father is a devil." If you really knew who I was, you'd be like Abraham who rejoiced at my coming. He looked at my coming and rejoiced. And they said, how can that be? You're not even 50 years old. How can Abraham even think about that? And Jesus said, well, before Abraham was, I am. Jesus is giving a hint there and here of his divine identity. He's connecting the phrase to God's revelation of himself to Moses at the burning bush in Exodus 3:14, when he responds to Moses' question about who it is that the Hebrews are, who he is to identify as the one who is sending him when the Hebrews ask the name of the person sending him. So when Moses is going to go back, he says, what if they ask about the name of the person of this God that is sending me? He says, you tell them, I am who I am has sent you. And then that's shortened to I am. This is what you shall say to them, to the sons of Israel, God says, I am has sent me to you. Well, the disciples were still in the process of having this realization come to them as they're on the boat. In due time, it would come to them. That's why they're recording it here. But for now, they were still having trouble comprehending. That they could at least come to recognize who they saw was Jesus, even as they understood him at that point, was reason for them to stop being afraid. Let me rephrase that and clarify. That they could at least come to recognize who they saw was Jesus, even as they understood him at this point, was reason for them to stop being afraid. They don't know all the implications of Jesus walking on the water and him saying, it is I. They're just glad to know it's Jesus. Here, the word for their being afraid is the typical one associated with fear. It's the word phobeomai, I am afraid, where we get the word phobia from. This and the noun phobos is used, and it recognizes how they were fearing a great fear. He was telling them, don't be afraid. Stop being afraid. It is I. We read on to the next and get to the conclusion as they reach to the other side. But as they learn about this and they recognize it's Jesus, they're still not understanding everything about this event and what it means. But let's go ahead and read verses 51 through 53. He tells them not to be afraid. Then it says this in verse 51, then he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished, for they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. And then it says, when they had crossed over, they came to the land at Gennesaret and moored at the shore. We'll come back and read verse 53 again as we come to what I call our bonus section. Well, he says, don't be afraid. It says that Jesus gets there to them. He made his way to the boat and then got in the boat with them. And two things followed when he did. First, notice this, the wind stopped. You remember in the first event with the storm on the sea, Jesus spoke to the wind and the waves, and they stopped. Here, merely his getting in the boat. At the time he got in the boat, the wind stopped. Secondly, the disciples were utterly astonished. So we see here their reaction changes. Um, the wind stops when he gets in the boat, and they are utterly astonished. So notice the change in emotion and reaction. Their reaction indicated that the timing of the wind stopping was not coincidental. This was an instance where correlation possibly did equal causation. In other words, they were afraid. Jesus says, don't be afraid. He gets in the boat, the wind stops, and they're astonished. Now, it could be that they're astonished by Jesus walking on the water. It could be that they're astonished by the fact that when he gets in the boat, the wind stops. There's a connection there, his power over the sea to walk on it and to control what happens with the wind. There is some causation here. He got in the boat and the wind stopped. He didn't speak to the weather this time. He just stepped from the water into the boat. But the reaction of the disciples was exactly the same as the reaction for those who witnessed Jesus raising Jairus' daughter from the dead. What I'm pointing out there from Mark 5:42 is that the reaction of the disciples with this wind stopping and Jesus walking on the water and getting in the boat is the same as when Jesus raised Jairus' daughter from the dead. There, the astonishment seemed to be a positive reaction. Here with the disciples, it was negative, as we'll see in a moment, verse 52. It was negative because of what Mark says next. Their fear had caused or had turned to astonishment, but their astonishment was on the basis of their understanding, or more specifically and accurately, their misunderstanding. The word for in verse 52 indicates that what follows is the rationale for what preceded. They were astonished for this reason. And the reason was that their astonishment, their being beside themselves, was because they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves. Your translation may not say incident, it just says from the loaves. But what the New American Standard is doing there is putting in italics the phrase incident to call back. That's what happened. That's the reference to the loaves earlier. It was the feeding of the 5,000. The implication was that had they understood more about Jesus' ability to multiply the food, they shouldn't be so surprised that he had the ability to walk on water. In fact, as we've seen and discussed before, and we'll discuss again, they've witnessed over and over again all the things that Jesus has done, and yet they still aren't grasping everything. This one is just a callback to the immediately prior event of the feeding of the 5,000. They were astonished at what they witnessed Jesus doing. They didn't understand what was going on with the loaves. There was a deeper reason for their lack of insight, Mark tells us. Their hearts were hardened. The statement is an illustration of the candid nature of Mark's Mark's narrative, particularly as it relates to Jesus' own disciples. He does not hide the disciples' struggles to understand who Jesus is. Take, for example, their reaction to Jesus stilling the storm we mentioned earlier. They had been afraid for their lives during the storm. When Jesus stopped the storm, he asked them, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" Despite what they had seen from Jesus to that point, they were lacking faith. Even after Jesus stilled the storm, even after Jesus stilled the storm, they became very much afraid. Who Jesus was, that the wind and the sea obeyed him. Go back to Mark 4, verses 40 to 41. They had been afraid. They were asking, who is this? What kind of man is this that the wind and the waves obey him? Then consider the ensuing episode in chapter 7. We'll be looking at chapter 7 of Mark in the next lesson. Notice this. In the ensuing episode in chapter 7, when the Pharisees confront Jesus with concerns that his disciples don't wash before eating and thus had unholy hands, Mark 7:2, we see after challenging the Pharisees on their giving priority to their traditions over the word of God, Jesus spoke that it was not what went into a person that made them unclean, but what comes out. Continuing then, the disciples asked what he meant. Jesus responded, "Are you so lacking in understanding as well?" Mark 7:18. And what I'm doing here is I'm illustrating different instances where Jesus does something or says something. The disciples question, and Jesus is rebuking them by way of question about their faith. Why are you afraid? Don't be afraid. Don't you understand? What don't you get? Later, then after the feeding of the 4,000, Jesus warned them of the leaven of the Pharisees. They thought there he was talking about bread, which they had forgotten when traveling in the boat. Mark 8:13 to 16. Well, you'll be able to read that on your own. Our unit doesn't go that far. But what Mark tells us is that when Jesus says to be weary of the leaven of the Pharisees, they think he's talking about bread, which they have forgotten to get. And Jesus has to rebuke them for that. He says this, "Do you not yet comprehend or understand? Do you still have yet hardened hearts?" That's in Mark 8:17, the response to their misunderstanding the bread. He questioned if they were like the people described in Isaiah, alluding to the same passage he referenced when explaining why he spoke in parables. He says, "Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear?" That's in Mark 8:18. But go back to Mark 4:12, where he quotes Isaiah 6, 9, and 10, and we looked at that in a previous lesson. Why does Jesus speak in parables? It's to reveal whose heart is hard and whose heart is ready. Jesus is asking the disciples in response to their not understanding that Jesus is talking not about bread, but something else. He's like, "Are you like the people where you have eyes, but you don't see? You have ears, but you don't hear?" Jesus had earlier told them that they had the kingdom. They knew about the kingdom, and that's why they didn't need to have the parables explained. Yet Jesus explained the parables. We're seeing that back and forth. They're seeking out understanding, but still lacking faith. The point is that the disciples are revealing their own struggle with faith and their own progress and journey of faith. The Gospels then are being realistic, that the disciples themselves are not the perfect example of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. They're on journey themselves. So you have in verse 20 or Mark 8:20 another follow-up to the question about the bread in that episode. After the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus asked them one more time, do you not yet understand? Yet again, example of their not understanding. And also also in an instance where Jesus was providing bread. So one parallel is here they don't understand what's going on because they don't understand the bread. Later on, in another instance after feeding, Jesus mentions bread. They don't understand. Jesus is revealing something about themselves. They just don't get it. Jesus had to endure unbelief by the people from his own hometown. Remember, we read that in Mark chapter 6, verses 1 to 6. He dealt with the lack of understanding among his own disciples. And what was the reason? Their hard heart. The Gospel of Mark then did not present the disciples, as we said, as model followers. They too were on a journey toward understanding. Where they fell short, the narrative reported it. Fortunately for them, they would continue to stick out with Jesus and learn and grow in their understanding. I mean, one of the reasons we can understand the Gospels as historically accurate is that it presents the disciples not as model disciples, but as struggling themselves with understanding who it was that Jesus, who Jesus was. There was a real struggle there. It wasn't just easy believism. It wasn't that Jesus did one miracle and they immediately believed. They were on course. While they had hard hearts, they still had persistent desire to know. That brings us to a conclusion of the narrative in this way, and we're going to then overlap into the last episode here just to kind of summarize what took place once they get to Gennesaret. In verse 53, you'll see a new verse, you'll see sometimes a new paragraph. We're going to use it kind of the bracket, the crossing of the sea, but then talk about what happens in that event, which itself is going to be a bracket to this larger segment of the ministry of Jesus. Let's talk about that real quickly. It says that they get across to the other side, and it says they moored at the shore. In other words, they dropped anchor. They crossed over and got to, like they did in Mark 5:21, they got there and they made it to the other side. Similar language used for when they made it to the other side where Jesus healed the demoniac. That they went on the land was necessary, of course, but also recalls how Jesus was, quote, on the land after he had sent the disciples ahead so he could pray before he walked on the water to join them. Go back and look at Mark 6:47 as we were reading. The point being is Mark is giving us similar language over and over again to point out the repetitious nature. They crossed over, they got out, they got on land. But getting on land is a bracket to the fact that Jesus was on land earlier when the disciples were in the boat. The New American Standard 2020 phrase with the idea of mooring at the shore describes that they had put the boat, or what they had done with the boat when they arrived. Simply, they put the anchor out so that the boat was staying still. Mark indicated they landed at Gennesaret. Remember, though, at the beginning, it said he sent them off to Bethsaida. We discussed that a little bit. Gennesaret was on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee. Bethsaida was north of the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. It could be that they had gone on to Bethsaida as Jesus instructed them, but then headed west, at which point Jesus encountered them as he was walking on the water. We mentioned this in lesson 11. Luke 9:10 said that they were at Bethsaida just prior to the feeding of the 5,000. So what do we do with all of that? It could be that the wind had taken them off course and pushed them westward, resulting in their landing at Gennesaret, which leaves us wondering what they were doing on the way to Bethsaida. Just know that neither gospel gives all the information about their movements. We don't see a strict chronology all the time, what's going on there. Regardless, though, the people of Gennesaret and that region would benefit from their arrival of Jesus or from the arrival of Jesus to the shore. Let me go on to the bonus material. I want to come back to the conclusion. As they get there, I won't read the text for sake of time. As they get there, other things take place similar to what's taken place when Jesus has gone to other areas. So what does take place? In verse 54, as the narrative progresses, there are so many events that we see that conjure up, if you will, things that Jesus had done in other places. So, for instance, Jesus and the disciples had arrived from traveling from another part of the lake. They get back as they've gone back and forth from the lake via the boat. And I won't read all the passages there that recount his traveling back and forth across the boat. I'm tempted to, but there's a lot. Just know that we've seen Mark tell us this back and forth movement. Well, then when Jesus and the disciples got out of the boat, the people recognized him. Again, notice these different events from time to time. This is the same word that was used to describe the crowds recognizing them as they were leaving to find a place of solace or solitude. So go back to when Jesus was taking the disciples. They've come back from their mission. He's taking them. He wants to take them to a solitary place, a secluded place. But what ends up happening is that they arrive and the crowds recognize them. So they end up going to another place. And when they get there, the people are there waiting for them. That same idea of recognizing takes place here. Something's happening that the people recognize Jesus, probably through the stories. Maybe some had seen him before. This is an area he might have been in before, but now he's staying for a little bit. And Mark tells us what took place during this time. The people did this, quote, immediately. There's that favorite adverb of Mark. It's ubiquitous in the Gospel of Mark. It's everywhere. Immediately they recognized him. Well, what happens? Verse 55, it says this: upon recognizing Jesus, the people ran around that whole country. This reminds us again of Mark 6:33, when they're moving towards where meeting Jesus, to meet Jesus where he and the disciples are planning to go. People are coming from the different cities and villages. Here, upon recognizing who Jesus is, the people go out to the different cities and they go out to bring people back. The people ran out in a different direction to the different places, and they did so with a view to be coming back to Jesus and bringing people back to Jesus. The people went to bring people to where Jesus was, and when they came back, they were bringing the sick with them. They brought them, listen carefully, they brought them to Jesus on pallets. We've even mentioned it in this lesson in reference to a previous example of Jesus demonstrating his deity. People came on pallets. Mark, in using this language, reminds us of that story. And by Mark saying they were going here and there, as the text says, wherever he had gone or wherever they heard he was, that indicates that when Jesus arrived at Gennesaret, he was moving around. People were going to different cities and bringing them to Jesus wherever he was. Notice again the use of the word pallets. That they were carrying them sick on their pallets, again, could call to remembrance what we had read earlier, what Jesus did at Capernaum in healing the paralyzed man. That's in Mark chapter 2, verses 1 to 13. And it's the same word with the same intent. There were people who were sick that couldn't walk. The people brought them to Jesus. And then we conclude with verse 56. Indeed, Jesus was traveling around in the area, and where he traveled, people sought him out. Mark said it didn't matter where he went, without exception, whether it was villages or cities or anywhere along the countryside, people were laying sick down before him to be healed by Jesus. Their desired method harkens back to Jairus on the one hand and the woman with the bleeding on the other. So go back and look at Mark chapter 5, where you have the conjunction of Jairus's daughter who was dying, along with the woman in the hemorrhage. The idea of touching, we'll see that in a moment. The idea that they brought them before Jesus to be healed. Notice the language that's used here. They implored Jesus that they might be healed. That same word is used to describe the language of Jairus and his request that Jesus heal his daughter in Mark 5:23, and where the NASB translates the phrase simply as pleading with him earnestly. Here they use the word implore. There's begging, strong pleading. Secondly, they wanted to touch just the fringe or the edge or the hem of his clothing. Notice here, that's the language that the woman with the hemorrhage described of her own actions. If I just touch the hem of his garment, I will be healed. Mark 5:28. Likewise, just as with the woman there, these came thinking just to touch him, they would be healed. But we may have mentioned this in a previous lesson in talking about the woman with the hemorrhage. There was something prior to that. Not long after we see Jesus casting out the demon, and then we see him healing the man on the pallet. In Mark chapter 3, there were those that went out toward Jesus who had diseases, pushing in on and around him in order to touch him. Mark 3:10. What am I saying there? There I pointed out that maybe the reason the woman was able or thinking about touching the hem of his garment is she may have been a part of that crowd that saw others seeking to touch Jesus. They were also in a crowd pushing against him. She was prompted then to touch him. Mark is telling us here there were others who were bringing people to Jesus with the hopes that even if they touched him, just that language, the edge or the hem of his clothing, they would be healed. Notice what then Mark is doing here. He's bringing in full circle all that Jesus had done in his ministry. And he's recognizing that wherever he went on ministry, he would do the same things. He would teach and he would heal. Well, as such, where Mark had earlier recounted Jesus acting on behalf of specific individuals, the paralyzed man, Jairus, and the woman with the bleeding, Here he noted Jesus did so over a brief period of time for different people. So I said this earlier in our lesson. Sometimes Mark will give us very specific details about an event, and other times he'll summarize some things. Here we've seen the specific walking on the water followed up with a general statement about all that Jesus did in a specific reason, in a specific region. What we see then is Jesus did here what he did elsewhere. So some conclusion. Let's think about this. If you had the opportunity to walk with Jesus day by day, how do you think you would have responded to what the disciples experienced? It's easy for us to say, had I been there, I would have done such and such. I often caution against that. Be careful, though, comparing, as I said, and even as I consider bringing that phrase to you, be careful making that comparison. Ask yourself, would you have been able to consider all you had witnessed of Jesus and be calm and assured that God was with you even when Jesus was not in their presence? Again, comparing ourselves in that way, would we have done what the disciples did, or would we have been better? Maybe we've been like the disciples. We often show our own hard heart sometimes. We often show that we're misunderstanding all that Jesus is doing. How much has Jesus already done for you and me, in addition to what we read about him in the Bible, and we still lack faith? And I'm saying that as a believer. The disciples were Jesus' disciples. They were his followers. They were his apprentices, as Scott McKnight says in his translation. They were there. They didn't understand everything. In much the same way, our walk with Jesus is we know enough about who he is. We're still learning about all that he is. I don't think our minds will be able to grasp all that he is. In the meantime, there are events that we encounter that we still lack faith. The disciples responded based on their worldview at the time. In other words, seeing him as a ghost. But Jesus was working on them to change that. The disciples, though wanting to follow and obey Jesus, still had difficulty understanding him and, as a result, changing their mindset. Remember, their idea of Messiah is different from what Jesus presents, and they're coming to terms with that. And in the long run, it's a better view. It's a more clear view. It's a more full view, but it takes them time. What work do we need to do to refashion our own worldview to conform to the truth of who Jesus is and to live in peace or in the peace of his presence, regardless of the dangers and trials we might face? Again, the walking on the water and the stilling of the storm is not an object lesson for stilling the storms in our life. We don't know all that is taking place, but we know that there are certain events that take place that reveal something about Jesus to us, and then we respond in kind. Does the fear that you experience in these dangerous times reveal your lack of understanding? Sometimes we started off the lesson with that. Sometimes when we lack understanding about a circumstance or a situation, we fear. In this encounter of Jesus walking on the water, the disciples missed it, but only for the time being. They would go on to misunderstand other things about Jesus, and we detail some of those in this lesson. They would experience the fear associated with that misunderstanding, but they were learning. And eventually, Mark, along with Matthew, Luke, and John, wrote their experiences down for future generations. Maybe that we don't have the same mistakes that they had. They did it to show their work through the learning process and giving us reason to believe in Jesus and to instill in us the confidence that we can have in him, even and especially when we fear the unknown. Even if it is Jesus himself, so to speak, right in front of us. May we learn then from the disciples' trial and error about the relationship that we have. In other words, their trial and error relationship has something to teach us. Maybe it's better to learn from their mistakes than to make our own mistakes. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to exhibit lack of faith. I just want to encourage you to take heart from what the disciples learned in their mistakes and recognize the power of Jesus. He is God in the flesh. He is now at the right hand of the Father, and yet he is still present with us by virtue of his Spirit. We have every reason to be assured and every reason to be confident and every reason to be at peace, regardless of the circumstances we face. And also the call to serve him in all that we do, to know that he is with us and guiding us. I want to encourage you to continue to go back looking at these events from the life of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark and all four Gospels and learn who Jesus is and who we are in relationship to him. I'll have one more thing to say as we get ready to go, but let me first have a word of prayer, then we'll talk about the next lesson as our last lesson for the unit. Father, we thank you for Jesus. We are in awe, and sometimes that awe expresses itself in fear because we don't always know how to interpret what it is that you're doing in our lives. The disciples were learning, and they struggled. Forgive us for looking down on them and help us to recognize our own faults Help us to see Jesus for who he is. And we already put our faith in him. For those who have not put their faith in Jesus, I pray that events like this would show how strong and powerful he truly is. He's worthy of our putting trust in him and giving our lives to him. Guide us as we have put into practice all that we've learned. Forgive us for the same mistakes the disciples made, and knowing that we've already seen them make the mistake and we have every reason to be more confident. And then take into consideration what you have already taught us through our own experience with you. Guide and direct us, Father. Help us to grow in our relationship with you and our love for you. Guide us by your Spirit to give us discernment and help us to bless your name and witness for you to the greatness of your power. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, real quickly, I know I've kept you. Let's look at the next lesson, our final lesson of the unit. We're going to be looking at Mark chapter 7, verses 1 to 23, entitled The Heart of the Matter. And what we're going to see there is Jesus' confrontation with the Pharisees regarding what the disciples are doing, and Jesus has to give some more lessons. What we're seeing then with what we just read in the end of chapter 6 of Mark is the one major phase in the Galilean ministry where Jesus has been going about doing his teaching and preaching and healing and demonstrating his great power. Coming back now to a circumstance where Jesus has confrontation with the religious leaders, another phase in the ministry of Jesus, but reprising some of that challenge and confrontation that took place early in the ministry. They're wrestling with who Jesus is based on what he does and based on what his disciples do. And of course, the phrase heart of the matter gets at it. It's a matter of the heart when we talk about that. We'll look forward to seeing you in the next lesson. Um, Phase one, or this phase is over. We'll look at the beginning of another phase. We won't finish it. We'll just bring to a conclusion this section of our unit with Mark chapter 7. Who knows, maybe in the future there'll be the rest of the gospel that we'll be able to look at together. We'll wait and see what GC2 Press does. In the meantime, until our next lesson, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his face to you and give you peace.